The Islamic State has yet to take responsibility for the attack on a Sufi mosque in northern Sinai on Friday that claimed 305 lives, but there is little doubt that it was carried out by Wilayat Sinai, an Islamic State affiliate in the Sinai. The organization has targeted Sufis before in other countries, and it is currently the only insurgent group operating in Sinai capable of such a large-scale attack. Which leads to the question, why is ISIS, currently in retreat in its former main strongholds of Syria and Iraq, still capable of such operations, in Egypt of all places? To really understand the Middle East, subscribe to Haaretz. Unlike Syria and Iraq, where Islamic State took advantage of the vacuum created by civil war and demoralized armies, Egypt, despite political upheaval in recent years, still boasts the largest army in the Arab world and for over 4 years, has been ruled by the iron fist of a military regime. The Egyptian army does not lack for the resources to fight a counter-insurgency war in Sinai, including mobile armored vehicles and attack helicopters. Israel has green-lighted every Egyptian request to reinforce its units in the peninsula, despite the demilitarization protocols of the Camp David peace accords. And yet, despite Egypt's ongoing campaign to wipe out ISIS in Sinai, a campaign which, according to foreign reports, includes major assistance from Israel, the group still retains the capability of launching the sort of devastating attack we saw on Friday. Greater than for Israel, the failure by Egypt's security forces is astonishing. Analysis: Egyptian army conscripts guard the Suez Canal University Hospital, where the victims of an attack on a North Sinai mosque received treatment. Ismailia, Egypt, November 25, 2017. Mohammed El Shahedafpa. A year ago, the tide seemed to have turned in Sinai. In a series of attacks on Wilayat strongholds, the Egyptians succeeded in eliminating an estimated 2/3 of the ISIS fighters, including their commander Abu Dwa al-Ansari. They were down to around only 300 men when Mohammed al-Asaw, known in ISIS as Abu Osama al-Masri, an Egyptian who had fought with the group in Syria, took command. Al-Masri, with reinforcements, aid and supplies from Islamic State's base in Libya, has succeeded in reviving the organization, with its numbers back to around 1,000 and more, damaging attacks on both military and civilian targets. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. Greater than Egypt is turning into Afghanistan, where permanent war is part of life. Analysis: according to intelligence sources, the Wilayat's fighting force is made up of Egyptian Islamists, volunteers from other countries, including veterans of Syria and Iraq, and most crucially, members of local Sinai Bedouin tribes. Their zone of operations is the northern half of Sinai, while for the most part, the Red Sea coast region in the south, where thousands of Israelis spent their high holidays vacation 2 months ago, has remained calm. This is not disconnected from the fact that while billions have been invested in building the Red Sea resorts, the villages and towns of the northern Mediterranean coast have remained underdeveloped. Until about 3 years ago, residents of the region were still making money from the open trade of the smuggling routes that run through the tunnels under the border with Gaza. Egypt has now destroyed all but a few of the tunnels, which are now used exclusively by Hamas and other Palestinian groups, for arms and personnel. While the local Bedouin tribes in the south are loath to jeopardize their income from Red Sea tourism by cooperating with ISIS in the south, those in the less developed north have fewer qualms. Egypt is now paying the price for decades of neglect of northern Sinai. Its soldiers hunker down in armored vehicles and fortified positions, while the jihadists enjoy cover from local collaborators there and in the nearby mountain passes. Egypt's energetic sponsorship of the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation agreement in recent months was mainly motivated by its interest in ensuring that Gaza doesn't serve as Islamic State's backyard, something it was in danger of becoming. But the Egyptians' real problem is within its own territory. It has allowed northern Sinai to remain a black hole of resentment and radicalism for too long and is now paying the price. Page 2. The massacre of worshippers at a mosque in Sinai on Friday, the deadliest jihadi terror attack ever in Egypt, is the Egyptian security forces' second failure in just over a month. In the previous incident, in the Giza district west of Cairo, more than 50 Egyptian policemen were killed in a raid gone wrong at a hideout of Muslim Brotherhood militants. After the first incident, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi fired his army chief of staff, now simply a presidential advisor. To really understand the Middle East, subscribe to Haaretz. From the Israeli point of view, the two Egyptian failures are astonishing. Especially in Sinai, it's hard to understand how after constantly fighting the Islamic State's Wilayat Sinai affiliate in recent years, the Egyptians have let fewer than 1,000 operatives carry out such murderous attacks. The ineffectiveness of the Egyptian security forces cries out to the heavens, especially when we remember the foreign media's reports that Israel has been extensively helping Egypt in intelligence and the use of drones against Islamic State strongholds. Greater than why the Arab world's largest army can't beat ISIS in Sinai analysis. The United States shares the frustration and surprise in a number of cases. Washington noted to Sisi and his people that the Egyptian security forces' preparedness was clumsy and predictable. In the fight against terror and guerrilla groups, quicker action is needed, combining precise intelligence and commando forces. The Egyptians are still very far from employing this method that resembles the way Israel combats terror groups. Imam of Egypt Mosque recounts deadly attack. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. Greater than unprecedented Sinai mosque attack may reflect shift in ISIS strategy analysis. From the Egyptian point of view, things aren't so bad, despite the terrible massacre in Sinai. If more than 300 had been killed in Cairo, for example, this would have presented a much greater challenge to the regime. Senior Egyptian officials have said more than once that the fight against terror, especially in Sinai, will take a great deal of time, and that they have patience. To them, they've chalked up plenty of achievements, above all getting some of the Sinai Bedouin tribes to fight the Islamic State. The backdrop for the recent attack might have been the refusal of the tribe in whose territory the attack took place to cooperate with ISIS. Cairo, in any case, perceives the war against fundamentalist groups as a battle on three fronts: on the Libyan border, in core Egypt, and in Sinai. The fighting on the Libyan front is more severe than in Sinai, and the Egyptians have seen some success there. The main concern, shared by Egypt and Israel, involves the possibility that Wilayat Sinai will now strengthen in light of events in the entire region. The defeat of the Islamic State and the fall of the Caliphate, the group established in Syria and northern Iraq, paves the way to a new era that Israeli intelligence calls ISIS 2.0. This is no longer control of a clearly defined territory, but rather a virtual caliphate, in which the group recruits young radicals for attacks via the internet, in Western countries as well, while taking advantage of Sinai's Great Desert. In a speech to the nation, Sisi promised that operations against the Islamic State would become more brutal. It may be assumed that the Egyptians will opt for a major show of force in Sinai while trying to reach understandings with more Bedouin tribes. The Islamic State has already taken into its ranks veterans of its battles in Syria and Iraq, a phenomenon that could increase in the coming months. Friday's attack showed a high degree of planning and implementation. The terrorists stormed the mosque where hundreds of worshippers were trapped and then set ambushes for rescue personnel. Such sophistication also worries the Israel Defense Forces, in case ISIS fighters who are also operating against Al-Qaeda's awakening local branch try an ambitious attack in the direction of Israel. Shaky Hamas. But reconciliation. The Sinai attack will delay the opening of the Rafah crossing, which Gazans have been waiting for impatiently following the reconciliation agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. But the status of the reconciliation talks is worse than the parties are willing to admit. For the moment, it seems high hopes will be dashed, completing the process by December 1st, launching the joint government's operations and putting the Rafah crossing into continual operation. The last round of talks in Cairo ended in utter failure. In this context, a kind of unsigned manifesto has been published detailing the ostensible understandings reached by the parties. This might have been a false report by Egyptian intelligence, which is mediating the process and now wants to calm things down. Among other things, it claimed that Hamas had agreed to accept the Palestine Liberation Organization as the only legal representative of the Palestinian people. It's hard to believe that Hamas would agree to this without promises of representation in PLO bodies, one of the main stumbling blocks in the negotiations. And so there's a double danger. One is the Palestinian people's loss of hope in light of the talks' failure, which could help reheat the border between Israel and Gaza. The second is the possibility that Islamic Jihad will request a chance to settle accounts after Israel blew up a tunnel on the Gaza border last month, killing 12 Islamic Jihad militants and 1 Hamas man. Page 3. Israel made no official response on Sunday to the trilateral agreement between Russia, America and Jordan on a ceasefire in southern Syria. The agreement, signed over the weekend, requires all foreign forces, including the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps and Shiite militias operated by Iran, to leave Syria. To really understand the Middle East, subscribe. But it does not set deadlines, and secret understandings among the parties provide for the IRGC and Iran's proxy forces to withdraw only a short distance from the Israeli border, at least in the near term. Israeli defense figures are troubled by this and by the fact that the superpowers seem unwilling to take genuine measures to kick Iran out of Syria in general, and southern Syria in particular. Israel Channel 2 News reported Sunday night that Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant Gen. Gabi Eisenkot secretly flew to Brussels on Thursday to meet with Gen. Curtis Scaparrotti, head of the U.S. Army's European Command. The meeting dealt mainly with Iranian moves in the Middle East, and especially Syria. Two men, not specified which group of rebels, ride a motorcycle towards an abandoned UN base at Syria's Kenitra border crossing between Syria and the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights, November 28, 2016. Ariel Shalit, AP Eisenkot, and Scaparrotti had met just 2 weeks earlier at an international gathering of chiefs of staff hosted by Washington. A second meeting so soon afterward presumably reflects the extent of Israel's concern over recent developments. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. Over the weekend, the BBC, quoting Western intelligence sources, reported that satellite photos show the Iranians are secretly building a base near Damascus. Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said Saturday that Israel won't allow Syria to become a forward base for the Shiite Axis, the site of an Iranian military compound in Syria. January 2017, Airbus, Mackenzie Intelligence Services via BBC Israel's repeated statements to this effect, which have been made, inter alia, in recent meetings with American, Russian and European politicians, attest to the growing concern of Israeli military and political leaders about Iran's moves in Syria. Tehran seeks to reap the fruits of its support for the Assad regime, which has gained the upper hand in Syria's civil war. Israel is presumably trying to warn Iran that it would view certain moves as crossing a red line and would consider military action to thwart them. But the trilateral agreement provides only a partial answer to Israel's concerns. Its attached map, which has not yet been published, specifies how far away the IRGC and the Shiite militias, including Hezbollah, must stay from the Israeli border. In September, Haaretz reported that Israel wanted them kept 50 to 60 kilometers away, but the Russians initially agreed to only 5 kilometers. The new map reflects a complicated compromise. In most areas it will apparently keep the Shiites 20 kilometers from the border, but in some places the distance will shrink to just 5 kilometers. Add in the fact that no timetable for removing foreign forces from Syria is even visible on the horizon, and Israel's concerns are understandable. The tension with Iran is joined by the developing crisis in Lebanon over the resignation of Prime Minister Saad Hariri, who is still in Riyadh. Senior Lebanese officials, including President Michel Aoun, have accused Saudi Arabia over the last few days of holding Hariri against his will, and Hezbollah has accused Riyadh of trying to foment a war between it and Israel. Sunday evening, Hariri gave an interview from Riyadh to the Lebanese television station Al Mustaqbal in which he denied he was being detained by the Saudis and promised to return to Lebanon in a few days. High alert in the south. A picture taken from the eastern outskirts of Gaza Strip shows an Israeli drilling machine stationed on the Israeli side of the border on November 12, 2017. AFP photo. Mahmoud Hamshams AFP. Though the situation in the north is so far confined to an exchange of verbal threats on the Gaza border, the IDF is genuinely on high alert. It has beefed up its forces along the border in preparation for the possibility that Islamic Jihad might try to carry out an attack to avenge Israel's destruction of a cross-border attack tunnel 2 weeks ago, in which at least 12 of the group's operatives were killed. On Saturday, the Army Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, Maj. Gen. Yoav Mordecai, warned that Islamic Jihad was playing with fire by planning a revenge attack. He threatened that if such an attack took place, Israel's response would also target the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip, and he urged Islamic Jihad's headquarters in Damascus to take matters into your own hands, or in other words, to restrain the group's military wing in Gaza and the West Bank. There are those who still amuse themselves these days by trying to renew attacks against Israel. We will take a very firm stance against anyone who tries to attack us or attacks us from any area. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Sunday. Islamic Jihad responded with a threat of its own, calling the Israeli statements a declaration of war. Page 4. A tunnel explodes underneath the Gaza-Israel border. A surprise resignation throws Lebanon into turmoil. A series of upheavals in the Saudi kingdom and the battle against Islamic State in Syria and Iraq winds down. All this is winding up with a new round of sabre-rattling between Israel and Iran and its proxies. Tack of war between elements of the Iran-led coalition and the unlikely anti-Iran alliance of Israel and the Saudis is rife, but a plausible scenario for one breaking out much less. Both sides would like to see someone taking on the other, but none of the parties are at present in a situation where it is their interest to do so themselves. To really understand the Middle East, subscribe to Haaretz. Here's where the parties who want war, just as long as someone else is fighting it, are right now. Iran. For the last 6.5 years, the Islamic revolutionary leadership in Tehran has invested heavily in propping up the Assad regime in Syria. This support has taken a variety of forms: military advisors from Iran's Quds Force, the deployment of thousands of Hezbollah fighters, frequent airlifts of weapons landing in Damascus airport, the recruitment of tens of thousands of citizens, mainly Afghan refugees, to fight in Shiite militias, and at least $1 billion of credit to allow Assad to remain solvent. None of this was enough to enable the Syrian president's eventual victory, but it kept him just about afloat until the Russians arrived in September 2015. Now that Assad's survival has been ensured, Iran is intent on reaping its reward in the shape of mining concessions for valuable minerals, and the rights to build an airbase on Syrian territory and a military port on its Mediterranean coast. Israel is both exerting diplomatic pressure and threatening to use military power to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent stronghold in Syria. This pressure is playing into a power struggle back in Tehran, where rival factions are arguing whether the additional billions that will be needed for building these bases should not go instead to strengthening Iran's economy at home. Tehran has no interest right now in a war between its proxies and Israel in Syria and Lebanon that would endanger the gains in which it has invested so much. Instead, it would prefer seeing Israel distracted elsewhere, and the most convenient place for that to happen would be along Israel's southern border with the Gaza Strip. A Hamas delegation is currently in Tehran, the second such delegation in a matter of weeks. Hamas and Iran had a falling out during the Syrian war when Iran was helping the Assad regime butcher hundreds of thousands of Syrian Sunnis, including Hamas allies in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. But now that the war is ending, the ties are being re-established. Throughout the war, Iran's support for Hamas rivals in Gaza, the more militant Palestinian Islamic Jihad, intensified. Now Iran would be happy for Hamas and PIJ to join forces in provoking some mayhem on the Gaza border and deflect attention from Syria. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. Gaza. Iran's entreaties notwithstanding, Gaza has its own troubles, and while Hamas is happy to re-establish ties with Tehran, the movement's interests currently lie in Cairo, where its reconciliation agreement with Fatah was signed last month. Egypt wants Hamas to keep the peace in Gaza and to make sure the Strip doesn't serve the ISIS fighters in Sinai as a logistical hub. If there was any doubt, particularly in Israel, that the reconciliation was yet another doomed-to-fail exercise, along came the demolition on October 30 by Israel of a PIJ cross-border attack tunnel, killing at least 14 PIJ and Hamas members underground. In the past, there would have been no question of such an operation ending without some form of retaliation by Hamas and PIJ. But instead, over a week later, we have yet to see any escalation. Hamas has forced PIJ to keep the unofficial truce that has been in force with Israel since the summer of 2014. Islamic Jihad fighters at a funeral for their comrades killed in an Israeli strike in Gaza, October 31, 2017, Mahmoud Hamsafp. Hamas, the ruling movement in the Strip, hasn't converted to Zionism, but the continued closure of Gaza and its worsening economic situation, intensified by the sanctions put in place during the last few months by the Fatah-dominated Palestinian Authority, have led Hamas' new prime minister in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, to the unavoidable conclusion that he must find a way for now of cooperating both with neighboring Egypt and the PA. It was either that or lose any capability of maintaining control in the Strip. Sinwar is a hardliner who sat for many years in Israeli prisons, but he is Gaza-born and understands local politics. Saleh al-Ariri, deputy chief of Hamas Political Bureau, Sinwar's rival and the leader of the delegations to Tehran, does not have any responsibility for Gaza. Hamas isn't giving up its rocket arsenal or tunnel network in the Strip, but it urgently needs to ease humanitarian conditions there, and the only way of doing so is by means of an alliance with Egypt and an uneasy rapprochement with the PA. Another round of destructive warfare with Israel will jeopardize the agreement, and Sinwar, for now, won't let that happen and is meanwhile preventing PIJ from retaliating. No matter what Iran wants. Egypt. Not too long ago, Egypt would have been counted as the major Arab element in the regional anti-Iran coalition. But its ongoing political and economic weakness has forced it to curb its wider designs and focus mainly on skirmishing with ISIS in Sinai, where a few hundred of the militant organization's fighters are still tying up a large part of Egypt's huge and well-equipped army. Egypt is probably the only nation that is about to lose out due to the elimination of the ISIS strongholds in Iraq and Syria. The remnants of ISIS are now relocating to neighboring Libya, and the organization may focus more of its remaining resources on Sinai. It would have been happy to see others carrying on the wars further afield, while focusing on affairs closer to home. Like Gaza, for example. Effectively, Egypt has abdicated its historic mission to lead the Arab Sunni camp, leaving the Saudis in charge. Egypt soldiers after clearing a protest camp near a mosque in Cairo, August 2013, Reuters. Saudi Arabia. The last few days' events in Riyadh have astonished veterans of the House of Saud. Multiple arrests over allegations of corruption of once senior officials, including a number of royal princes' appointments to key positions of men close to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman aka MBS, a mysterious helicopter crash, and the summoning of Saudi clients such as Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri, who chose on Saturday to announce his resignation from Riyadh, and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. All this has pundits trying to work out a common motive, aside from just another move by MBS to consolidate his grip over the kingdom. One popular theory regarding Hariri's resignation is that he fled to Riyadh, or was ordered there, so he would not be implicated in an impending military attack by Israel on Lebanon, with Saudi backing, or an attack on Iran's main proxy in Beirut, Hezbollah. The fact that Hezbollah has been accused of an assassination attempt on Hariri strengthened this theory. The Saudis would certainly love to have their Iranian rivals punished at this point, in some way or another, and Hezbollah would be a good target. The regime in Riyadh is in no position to launch a war itself against Iran. For the last 2.5 years, the Saudis have been engaging in a war against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, which has been so unsuccessful that on Friday night, the Houthis were capable of taunting the Saudis by firing a ballistic missile at Riyadh airport. The Saudis are unlikely to risk a cross-Gulf offensive with the much more powerful Iranians, especially when MBS is so busy with internal politics. But will Hezbollah respond in any way to the accusations? Saudi Arabian security forces march in a military parade in Mecca, August 23, 2017. Handoutreurs Hezbollah. After fighting for over 6 years in Syria as Iran's vanguard, Hezbollah can credit itself with some impressive victories and has accumulated major experience, both in the use of advanced weaponry, and in the command and control of military formations as large as brigade-size units. But they have lost at least 800 men in the fighting and thousands more have been wounded, totaling about a quarter of Hezbollah's original force at the start of the war. Thousands of new conscripts have been trained and sent to Syria, but while this has widened the ranks, it has also fed resentment back home in Lebanon, where many, including some within the Shia community, feel that Hezbollah has long ago ceased to serve as a Lebanese resistance force and is now holding the country hostage, in the service of Iran. Militarily, Hezbollah is in no condition to launch an attack on Israel. It is still fighting in a number of locations in Syria and has to rebuild its units before embarking on a new war. 18 months after the death of its military commander, Mustafa Badruddin, almost certainly an assassination carried out by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, at Iran's urging, a replacement has yet to be announced. Nasrallah has lost the standing he enjoyed in the Arab world following the Second Lebanon War in 2006. He's no longer seen as the plucky resistance fighter, but rather as the murderer of Syrian resistance fighters. Another war with Israel, with the prospect of rehabilitating his image, may seem tempting, but Nasrallah is aware that his men are not ready and that a devastating response by Israel, targeting Lebanese civilian infrastructure, may actually yield the opposite result, with him being blamed by the Lebanese for yet more suffering. But if Hezbollah is in such a vulnerable position, could Israel be tempted to take advantage of it? Hezbollah fighters in southern Lebanon, February 18, 2017, Mohammed Za'atari, Israel. One thing is almost certain: even if Hariri and the Saudis thought that an Israeli attack on Lebanon is imminent, it won't be happening in the next couple of weeks. Israel is currently hosting the largest international military exercise ever to take place in the country, with 7 foreign air forces from 3 continents participating. This is a show of military diplomacy that has been over a year in the planning, and the Israel Air Force has little time right now for anything else. War won't start at least until the end of the month, and by then tensions may have died down elsewhere. For now, however, Israel is interested in keeping the calm around Gaza. Its new underground defense system against Hamas and PIJ attack tunnels is still being deployed and won't be operational for another 12 months. Besides, Israel doesn't want to interfere with Egypt's attempts to try and pacify the Strip. The situation with Hezbollah along Israel's northern border is more complex. Israel has been regularly attacking Syrian targets, usually Hezbollah convoys trying to smuggle advanced weapons back to Lebanon, or military research facilities. Syria has tried a number of times recently to fire rather ineffective missiles at Israeli planes, but beyond that there has been no response from the Assad regime or from Hezbollah. There are some voices in the Israeli security establishment that are in favor of a preemptive strike against Hezbollah's rocket positions in Lebanon at the present time, but they are in a minority. Benjamin Netanyahu, for all his anti-Iranian rhetoric, is loath to expand hostilities with Iran's main proxy, beyond surgical pinpoint attacks. The lessons of 2006 are still fresh in the minds of Israeli military planners, and anyway Netanyahu is much more risk-averse than his belligerent image and has never been a fan of wide-scale operations that necessitate mobilizing the entire army. He would of course be more than happy to see someone else take Iran head-on, like the Americans, for example, but while there has been no lack of anti-Iran rhetoric from the Trump administration either, there doesn't seem to be an appetite for going beyond a war of words in Washington. Former U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said at Chatham House in London Monday that the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia and Egypt had all urged President Barack Obama to bomb Iran early on in his term. But none of them tried to do it themselves. That still seems to be the situation. Israeli soldiers crossing the Lebanon border, 2006, David Gutenfelder, AP page 5. Remember how only 4 days ago everyone was so worried that Donald Trump would destroy the nuclear deal with Iran? Well, he went ahead and decertified the deal, ostensibly opening up the way for Congress to impose new sanctions on Iran, which potentially could derail the agreement. But Congress doesn't seem eager or capable of mustering a majority behind new sanctions, and meanwhile the other nations that signed the Iran deal, and of course Iran itself, are doing everything possible to keep it alive. Successy, it appears. Meanwhile, in Iraq, Iran has been on the move. U.S. trained and financed Iraqi army units, along with Iranian-backed Shiite militias, at least one of which Washington considers a terror group, are beating into submission the Iraqi Kurds, without a doubt the most pro-Western element in Iraq. The capitulation of the Kurdish fighters Sunday in Kirkuk and Monday night in Sinjar was precipitated Sunday morning by a visit to the Kurdish region by Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds Force. Whatever threats or promises Soleimani made to the leaders of one of the main Kurdish parties evidently worked, as its members melted away from their positions around Kirkuk, exacerbating the already tense divides among the Kurds. Haaretz infographics greater than after ISIS loses its capital, focus turns to strengthening global terror network analysis. Iran's interests are clear. An increasingly independent Kurdish entity on its borders will both encourage the millions of Kurds in Iran to seek autonomy and even independence. Just as worrying for Tehran, an independent Iraqi Kurdistan would be a bridgehead with which the mainly Kurdish forces fighting the Islamic State in eastern Syria could link up, cutting off the route along which Iran plans to construct its Shiite Crescent Land corridor, connecting its proxies all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. Betraying another ally. The United States of course is deeply invested in the Iraqi army. Billions of dollars in aid and advanced weaponry have gone to rebuilding the army over the last decade, with the help of thousands of U.S. military advisors. Washington has also worked closely with the Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria, in the campaign against the Islamic State. It would have been natural for the Trump administration to discreetly advise the government in Baghdad to sit down with the Kurds and keep the Iraqi army away from Iraqi Kurdistan. Instead, Washington has merely issued bland statements calling on the sides to negotiate, without an exercise of power on the ground or behind the scenes. Once again, a pro-Western ally of America in the region has been betrayed and Iran has been allowed to gain the upper hand. Greater than get all updates on Israel, Trump and Iran. Download our free app, and subscribe. Greater than supporting the Kurds and acting to decisively to cut off the Shiite Crescent are just two on a list of actions the United States could take to act more forcefully against Iran's influence in the region, all more effective and less controversial than fulminating against the nuclear agreement. The administration could impose more effective limits on the Iraqi and Lebanese armies, both of which receive American aid and weapons, to ensure they don't allow Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and PMU militias in Iraq access to these weapons. But while there is ample proof of U.S. supplied tanks and other armored vehicles being commandeered by these proxies, there is no sign of the administration clamping down. Both in Lebanon and Iraq there are major elements in the local Shiite leaderships that resent Iran's iron-handed remote control. The United States could do a lot more to engage with them. Another proposal that has been mooted is designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps a terror organization. Such a move would impose severe restrictions on the global operations of the Guards Quds Force and cause it significant financial damages, as it controls a large part of the Iranian economy. But a move against the Guards would also cause discord between the regime and Tehran and many Iranians who have suffered violence at the hands of the Guards' besieged militia. Last week Iran's moderate Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif tweeted that, "Today, Iranians, boys, girls, men, women are all IRGC standing firm with those who defend us the region against aggression terror," only to be met with derision from thousands of Iranians who tweeted back at him, "We're Jakturg." The United States slapped sanctions on the Guards last week but didn't go all the way. Another course that the administration could take is seriously engaging with the Russian government on Syria's future. The world stood aside when 2 years ago Russia deployed its military to Syria, bolstering the Assad regime and bombing into submission civilian areas that were held by rebel groups. Syrian President Bashar Assad's survival is assured for now, but that doesn't necessarily mean the regime's Iranian sponsors should be allowed a portion of the blood-soaked spoils. Many of Russia's demands may be very unpalatable, but it would surely be worth a shot just to find out what would influence Vladimir Putin to minimize Iran's role in post-war Syria. Iran a la Obamacare. None of this, however, seems to be happening. Which begs the question, where is Trump's much-vaunted anti-Iran strategy that we've been hearing about for so long? If you want to understand Trump's real position on Iran, all you have to do is compare it to his policy on health care. Wait, he doesn't actually have one. Besides getting rid of Barack Obama's Affordable Care Act and replacing it with whatever half-baked incoherent bill he can somehow push through Congress. As long as he gets rid of Obamacare, Trump couldn't care less about Iran. He probably can't even locate it on a map, but just like he wants to erase all memory of his predecessor's major domestic legacy, he wants to erase Obama's landmark foreign policy. In the case of the Iran deal, he is also being egged on by Benjamin Netanyahu and the Prime Minister's supporters in the United States. They are obsessed with the nuclear agreement, which for all its many imperfections is the Obama administration's only real achievement in the Middle East because of its limits on Iran's nuclear development. The deal has vastly contributed to the current administration's blind eye toward all the other ways Iran is increasing its influence in the region. As the abandoned Kurds can now attest, Trump cares little about America's allies and isn't concerned about protecting them from Iran. But his, and Netanyahu's, obsession with Obama's nuclear deal has helped Iran gain valuable ground. Page 6. Saudi Arabia's powerful Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman said on Sunday an attack on an Egyptian mosque that killed more than 300 worshippers would galvanize an Islamic military coalition that aimed to counter terrorism and extremism. MBS, as the Crown Prince is widely known, vowed to pursue terrorists until they are wiped from the face of the earth. Top defense officials from 40 Muslim-majority nations met in Riyadh on Sunday. They are part of an alliance gathered together 2 years ago by Prince Mohammed, who is also Saudi Defense Minister. MBS has said he would encourage a more moderate and tolerant version of Islam in the ultra-conservative kingdom. Prince Mohammed told delegates that Friday's attack in Egypt was a very painful occurrence and must make us contemplate in an international and powerful way the role of this terrorism and extremism. MBS also declared that, in past years, terrorism has been functioning in all of our countries with no coordination. This ends today, with this alliance. Gunmen carrying the flag of Islamic State attacked the mosque in North Sinai. We've got more newsletters we think you'll find interesting. Click here. Please try again later. The group of Muslim nations, called the Islamic Military Counterterrorism Coalition, has yet to take any decisive action. Officials say the group would allow members to request or offer assistance to each other to fight militants. This could include military help, financial aid, equipment or security expertise. The group, which will have a permanent base in Riyadh, would also help combat terrorist financing and ideology. The biggest threat from terrorism and extremism is not only killing innocent people and spreading hate, but tarnishing the reputation of our religion and distorting our belief, Prince Mohammed told officials from the Middle East, Africa and Asia. Iraq and Syria, at the forefront of the battle against Islamic State, are not members, nor is mainly Shiite Muslim Iran, the regional rival to mostly Sunni Saudi Arabia. Qatar, originally part of the alliance, was not invited to Sunday's meeting after Riyadh led a group of states seeking to isolate Doha, saying it supported terrorism. Doha denies this. Abdullah al-Saleh, a Saudi lieutenant general and the coalition's secretary-general, said Qatar was excluded to help build a consensus for launching operations. He also said the group was not aimed at creating a Sunni bloc to counter Iran. The enemy is terrorism. It's not sects or religions or races, it's terrorism, Saleh told reporters. Saleh said military initiatives had been proposed to the group's ministerial council, but he did not elaborate. Despite agreement on principles, members voiced different priorities at the meeting. Yemen's delegation said the focus should be Iran, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, while Turkey called for support from our friends against Kurdish separatists. Critics say the coalition could become a means for Saudi Arabia to implement an even more assertive foreign policy by winning the backing of poorer African and Asian nations with offers of financial and military aid. Alongside leading a diplomatic charge against Qatar, Saudi Arabia is also leading a war against Iran-aligned Houthi rebels in its neighbor Yemen. Saleh said Riyadh would pay the 400 million rial $107 million bill for the coalition's new center, but said other nations could offer financial support for specific initiatives.